Hey guys, it's Navonod No Limit Hold'em. Once again, I've had a couple of people, well, this time it was just a person, allegedly shark scope me and tell me that I'm stuck 5 figures or something crazy. So I'm just showing this 195. This is a positive net activity on my account. I know I've done this a couple of times. I've showed you that. I think I showed the cash out. I know I showed the $100 balance growing 4. I know I showed the 0. I know if you've been with me for a long time, you've seen the entire run it up from nothing situation. You've seen me start with no money and run it on up. I only ever deposited $50, and yeah, so I mean, at the risk of sounding like someone who protesteth too much, if you've been following, you know that I just recently cashed down to from $420 to $100, and here I am with $385 in my account. I am winning. So anyway, on to poker. So I'm going back and re-narrating, re-recording audio for this. I played a guy who was a pretty good player for NL5. I explained that I was just going to be doing a real quick little $5 warm-up game, but I became intrigued with my opponent, and so instead I started blowing off buy-ins to him. Now, I don't want to have to go through an entire hour's worth of our play and narrate, but I do want to just tell everybody he beat me. And I did like a real solid training video. Like I did a coaching video for Austin. I recorded our session, and I gave you advice about what I saw in your ranges. I know I've promised to tell you about some things that are not going to be on this first video. If you're real curious about it, I know there were a couple spots in particular you'd asked me about. We can get into them, but okay, let's just look at this one first. So normally I would barrel, or I would bomb the turn after pre-flop razor checks back, but I picked up a pair of threes and thought it was unlikely I could get him to fold anything better, and he probably wasn't going to call with too much that's worse. So I elected to just check, and I was expecting this to go to showdown very often. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, most likely he just hit the 5 and I just lose. But there's probably some fold equity in raising, although wait a second, what am I raising against? Exactly a 5, probably not worth it. Let's look at the pot odds, let's take the price, and let's get an idea of what he's checking back on the flop as pre-flop raiser. We'll win some of the time, and the information that we glean is going to be best gleaned in hand number 1. Well worth it. Okay, so he checked back a pair of 7s on that flop, which I think makes total sense. And that tells me straight away that Austin understands showdown value, and he's going to probably have more of a polarized continuation bet strategy. And when he checks back the flop, I'm going to be able to bomb the turn as long as I'm willing to commit to a second barrel. So if I didn't have this information, I would maybe just, whenever he checks back flop, just blast away at the turn, and then if he calls, shut down. But now I know that he's checking back his showdown value, that's planning on probably bluff catching at least one street. So now that I know that, I know that if I'm going to bet the turn as a bluff after he checks back his pre-flop raiser, then I need to follow through with another bet on the river. One thing I noticed in Austin's game is that Austin is very sticky. I think you called down a little bit too light. You called too frequently. You called with some really kind of odd hands, and you called too many 3-bets. I was not 3-betting very often, and I made a 3-bet with ace-9 and got it called by jack-3 suited possibly. And I don't think that's a play that makes a lot of sense. I think you need to be either folding that, or if you think it'll get through often enough, or if you think my range is going to be weak enough, then you can consider 4-betting it. But I don't think you can be, you definitely don't want to be flat calling 3-bets with jack-3 suited against my 3-bets. It's not going to be a profitable scenario. I don't think. So there were now one thing you did a really good job of. One thing you'll see Austin doing a good job of is really varying and mixing up his play. Now, as it turned out, as I played with him a little bit more, I realized that his check back, his flop checkbacks were actually a lot more balanced than I'd anticipated. He was checking back enough value hands that it made it pretty difficult for me to just attack all of his checkbacks, and he was also turning some of his hands, I think, into bluffs when I did bet the turn. So if you're like me and you like to start out a match with a polarized c-betting range, meaning like you're going to c-bet the flop if you have a value hand or a bluff, but you're going to check back with your mediocre stuff, which I think is good against micro-stakes and small stakes players until they figure it out. But if you're going to be doing that, once your opponent starts bombing a bunch of turns against you and double barreling a lot, that's definitely one adjustment that can hurt us. Austin, it's your game too, so this is for you specifically. But really anyone who is, as pre-flop raiser, is going to typically bet a range of something like top pair, well, a range of something like second pair good kicker or better, and draws, if that's going to be your c-bet range plus all of your air, then the first adjustment an opponent can make against you is every time you check back, they know that you've got a capped range where you're unlikely to have like even top pair, or probably not even likely to have second pair with a decent kicker. So if that's what you're doing, what your opponent can do to exploit that is make a ton of term bets. Like every time you check back, if I just blast a pot-sized turn bet in, that's going to make life hard for you. If I take it one step further, and this is, I think, the first correct adjustment against somebody who's checking back all of their showdown value, is once they check back as pre-flop raiser, make a pot-sized bet on the turn, and then a little bit bigger than a pot-sized river bet, like maybe 1.5 times the pot, and it's going to be very hard for a player who's checking back their bluff catchers and showdown value type hands on the flop as pre-flop raiser. It's going to be very hard for them to call a big bet on the turn and a huge bet on the river. Another thing you can do to take advantage of these players, so something you need to watch for, Austin, is if people start seeing you checking back flops and they start noticing that you're c-betting a polarized range of air and like value hands, then they can start using a lot of small check raise bluffs and small value check raises, and it's something I did not do against you, but I didn't catch on to the fact for sure that you were doing this until I noticed that you started to balance your turn range anyway. So, but something players can do if they catch on to it quicker than what I did is they can start to notice that you're c-betting your air and you're c-betting your good value hands. And if you're c-betting all of your air and all of your big value hands, then you're going to have a lot more air in your range when you c-bet than you're going to have value hands, because there's just more ways to flop air than there are value. So one thing somebody could do against you is to, every time you make a continuation bet on the flop as pre-flop raiser, they can make a check raise that's going to fold your air out. It's small, it doesn't have to be big. The player does not have to waste a bunch of chips. And they can attack your polarized c-bet range with a ton of check raises of their own. And they can keep the sizing small, because if you have air, the sizing doesn't need to be very big to cause you to at least theoretically have to fold. And because when they run into the value part of your c-bet range, they don't lose so much with the check raises. So that's something you need to watch out for. This bet, I don't think there's any hand you could be making this bet with that makes sense. If you have a queen, you want me to call with the ace, right? I don't know why you would check a queen back. I don't think a queen plays this way anyway. But there is nothing in the way I played that hand that makes it impossible for me to have a full house. And I'm not folding a full house. So you basically, no matter what you had, if you were bluffing, you risked way too many chips to bluff, because sometimes I'm going to wake up with a hand and call you. And when I don't have a hand, you don't need to risk so many chips to get me to fold. The other thing is, if you had a value hand, then you want to get called, and my ace high was pondering a call, but really not able to make the call. Now, definitely, I'm going to have more showdown value in my range, like ace high exactly, than I'm going to have full houses, but I will not have to have a full house very often, or just get retard sticky and just hit the call button with something that's not a full house very often to make your overbet a bad play. If your range was super polarized, I could get behind a really big bet, but I don't think your range, I mean, in some sense, when you make a bet that big, you're automatically polarizing your range, but I don't think you should use enormous bet sizes out of nowhere in order to accomplish the goal of polarizing your range. I think that you should use large bet sizes when your range happens to be polarized. And that may just be a little conceptual thing that you've not quite put together. And again, by and large, I want to say, you played very unpredictably, and you mixed it up well, while still most of the time making bets that are going to be like good value bets that can be called by worse hands. And I think most of the time you were bluff catching with the right parts of your range. You were trying to get the right parts of your range to showdown. You were bluffing the right parts of your range most of the time. But one critique I want to give you about that or regarding that, hold on 1 second. Running out of saliva, got a little cotton mouth here. Alright, one of the things that about that is you seem to be making loss leader plays. And if you're not familiar with the concept or the term, a loss leader is a play that is kind of intentionally minus EV, or at least it kind of disregards the fact that it might be slightly minus EV. It's a losing play that you make for the benefit of your overall strategy. I think it was David Sklansky that said he defined the metagame as trading small mistakes for bigger mistakes. And you could look at that definition and you could say, okay, I'm leveling, or I'm playing the metagame. And what I want to do is I want to play in such a way that my line doesn't make very much sense, so that the next time I get into a spot like this where my line does make sense, it'll be more valuable, more profitable. And that's okay, or ballpark okay, but in reality, if you're playing a game theory optimal game, if you're at Nash, if you're at equilibrium, if you're playing perfect, you will never, there's no such thing as a GTO loss leader. There's just going to be enough spots that come up in play where the decision to take line A or line B are so close that neither one is clearly better than the other, and those spots will allow you to mix your play up perfectly well. You don't need to actually go negative on a particular hand for the sake of your strategy. That ace-5 offsuit shove I just made, I want you to look at that, and I want you to remember it, and I want you to add it to your game. We played enough matches that I saw when we get down to like under 20 big blinds, you were allowing me to min-raise pretty much at will without ever having to be punished for it. One of the nasty things that a player can do to you when you get down to like 18 big blinds effective is a player can just ship a very wide range against your min raises, and there's not a lot you can do about it. I did it to you, you didn't do it back to me. And that's kind of the, I guess that relates to the principle of reciprocity. In any situation where there's a thing that I do that you don't do and it's good, that's my edge. Okay, and here, this is an interesting hand. Actually, let's pause this. Okay, let's pause this. I don't know how to pause it. Okay, let me rewind it. I think I know how to do that. Oh, shit. Okay, yeah, I've had some technical difficulty with my recording software today. I'm not sure why. But in that play, maybe rewind it. I'm sure you can rewind. And look at that play. My line might have looked kind of odd. I think we talked about it. Maybe, maybe not. But we talked about a similar spot that came up that you were confused about, and this will explain both of them. So just rewind and watch the rest of this after this explanation. What happened in that hand was I ended up donk leading the river because I improved to a hand that was strong enough that I was going to have to call if I checked. So if I check, you're going to bet all your better hands and I'm going to have to call you. But I thought all of the hands that I was ahead of that would call if I bet would simply check back if I checked. So that's a spot where had I checked, likely you would have checked back and you would have lost less than you did. And if I checked and you had me beat, you would have bet and I'd have had to call you. So instead of giving you kind of like a free roll to bet when I'm going to lose and check back when you're going to lose, I want to lead that river myself so that you don't have the option to check back and go to showdown with your mediocre hands and then just value bet your super powerful hands. So, okay, now this was a spot where I planned on betting flop and turn, and I kind of thought that the 8 wasn't a good card to do that on. So here we are, we bet flop, and then we had a gut shot, we had 2 overcards, we had 3 to a flush draw, we had, a lot of stuff going on, none of it panned out, all kinds of bad stuff happened, and I'm still sitting here thinking about raising. And I think that's an emotional thing. I got stubborn because you can sometimes like get attached to a spot where you're like, man, I should win this pot, and then you don't. And so you might kind of try to make up high variance ways to win that money anyway. Definitely don't do that, but that's more coaching for myself than for you. So I think going back to the ace-5 offsuit ship, like when I shipped it at like 20 big blinds or whatever it was, the reason we're doing that is because at 20 big blinds, reverse implied odds are a bitch. But implied odds are not that good. There's different stack sizes that favor things like implied odds or that shove them more into the forefront. This ought to be an interesting hand. This is one where I've got the 3-4 6 blank 7, or the 3-4 blank 6-7 with overcard and backdoor flush draw. So that's one where I would have got pretty aggressive with, but you folded the flops or whatever. So when you're at 20 big blinds or under, you ought to have some hands that are going to move all in against a min raise, because that's going to make your opponent's min raises less profitable. You don't have to do it as a loss leader. You want to do this with hands that are profitable to move all in with. And the hands that are going to be the most profitable to do this with are going to be hands that have bad reverse implied odds problems and don't play well in general post-flop. They're hands where you're probably going to you're going to have to make a lot of mistakes if you call and you have to play out of position. In a hand like pocket 2s or ace-5, they make really good candidates for this. Because at under 20 big blinds, reverse implied odds that come from being dominated are still pretty painful, but the implied odds that come from like flopping a set with a pair of 2s, for instance, they're just not there because it costs too much to invest the money to try to set mine. You'll never make it back up in implied odds by set mining. You just don't make enough to recoup all of the times you just have to check and fold on the flop. Now, bigger pocket pairs like pocket 7s, 6s, 8s, you can flat call those with 18 big blinds, or you can move in with them. I think that's more optional. But if you're going to have some hands that move all in, and you're going to have some hands that call, and you're going to have some hands that make smaller non-all-in raises, and I think at around 20 big blinds ballpark, you should have all those ranges. In order to like have a good starting point. I think you start with like pocket fours, pocket threes, pocket twos, and all of your ace X that are ace 2 through ace 5. I call them ace wheels, or even like ace wheel suiteds, because the suitedness it doesn't help you enough post flop when you have that stack size to make up for the fact that you have so much to gain from folding out your opponent's equity and just picking up the money that's in the middle, especially after they make a min raise. So you want to take hands that are not going to play that well post-flop. Hands where if you flop something like top pair, you're still going to be in a tough spot if a lot of money goes in. And you're going to want to use hands like small pocket pairs that if all of the money goes in, even when you get called, like if your opponent min raises, you're at 20 big blinds and you shove pocket deuces, you're hoping your opponent folds. There's plenty of dead money to pick up. Pretty much any hand your opponent has is going to have tons of equity against you as long as he doesn't have a 2 in his hand. He's got nearly a coin flip anyway. So you benefit a lot from folding out even a hand like 6-5 offsuit. When you jam pocket twos, you benefit a lot when your opponent folds even Jack 4 offsuit. You benefit a lot even when he folds Jack, or even if he folds like 7-3 and you're holding twos. You get a lot done. And when you do get called at 20 big blinds or 18 big blinds, when your opponent min raises and you shove pocket deuces with 18 big blinds, when you get called most of the time, you're going to have a little bit the best of it. Once in a while you're going to be really in bad shape when your opponent flips over a bigger pair, but that happens infrequently enough that just kind of a ballpark guess, and you could check this with Equilab or something like Poker Stove if you've got, I think there's a paid version of that now. But any kind of equity calculator, if you plug in a reasonable range that might call a, say, 19 big blind re-steal all in, if you plug in a range that's likely to call that shove against pocket twos, I'm going to guess that you'll be at about, if I had to guess, I'd say 38%. That's off. I was thinking like somewhere between 36 and 40. So you'll have, you're only going to be a 3-2 dog, roughly, against the range that calls you, and you benefit a ton from folding out your opponent's equity. You can kind of look at it in a similar light as you would look at a flopped flush draw. When you like check jam a flush draw on the flop, you're hoping for a fold. You do really well to fold out almost anything if you've got like a flush draw with no pair or a flush draw with no ace high even. So you benefit a lot from folding your opponent's equity out, and even when you run into a strong hand, you still have plenty of equity against the range that calls you. So I look at reshoving ace 5 and pocket twos at 20 big blinds. I look at that a lot like I'd look at check jamming a flush draw on the flop. It's going to be a spot where you do real well to get a fold, and if you get called, it's not the end of the world. Plus, there's not that much value in flat calling and trying to play the hand out of position. So that's one thing. I don't think you ever made a reshove at 20 big blinds, and we got to that spot plenty. I do think that once you saw that I was reshoving relatively often at that stack size, I think that you should have adjusted and did not adjust. Now, you did make some adjustments, and you did become very difficult to play against, and one of the great adjustments I saw you make is you really picked up on the fact that every time you checked back the flop, I was betting the turn, and I think you adjusted more with your turn play than you adjusted your flop range, although I can't say that with any certainty. And if that's the case, I say it's okay, and it's something you should do, but I think step one is to adjust your flop play. And if your opponent is going to start blasting into you every time you check back the flop, then what you really need to do is you need to start checking back some of your top pairs, and that way you're going to have some hands that can call down. and you might want to occasionally check back a monster. And I would do it when the board is pretty dry, you've got the board on lockdown, say with like pocket queens on queen 7 deuce rainbow. If you see that your opponent's going to be blasting the turn an awful lot when you're checking the flop back, then you may want to just go ahead and uncap your check back range by checking back top set on dry boards. Another thing that you can do is when you see somebody is taking this approach, like blasting away when you check back the flop, is you can start checking back your draws that also have showdown value. So where it's the most standard thing in the world as pre-flop raiser to just go ahead and make a continuation bet when you flop the nut flush draw. Another thing you can do is you can occasionally check back, and one of the reasons you want to occasionally check back is because if your opponent knows that you're always c-betting your flush draws and there's a flush draw open on the flop and you check back and the flush hits the turn, then your opponent could theoretically just rip it in, just move all in 100% of the time on the turn, and you could like never call, right? Or you could just make a very big bet on the turn and jam the river, whatever. Neither of those things are good for you. Now, what you can do is check some of your flush draws back. And if you're playing against an opponent who's picking up on your imbalances and who's pretty good and knows how to exploit certain things and how to adjust, how to make changes in their ranges and the lines they take based on your strategy, your ranges, your mistake propensity, your style, then you do need to be balanced. You do need to make sure that you can have a flush when you check back the flop. So, and the flush card comes on the turn. So, since if you're playing against a good opponent, you want to make sure that if the flop goes check, check, and you are the pre-flop raiser, and then a 3 flush comes on the turn, that you can sometimes have a flush. The best way to do that, I think, is to check back your flush draws that also have showdown value. So taking a hand like pair plus flush draw and checking it back can be a really good idea, because you'll be able to comfortably call any turn bet, and you'll be able to raise a good percent of turns as well. And that can be a really good move to have in your arsenal. And I think you do have that move in your arsenal. I know you have the move. I know you're doing it some of the time on the turn, but I wasn't able to see. One of the things that kind of sucked is while I was trying to do this like little mini coaching session, I wasn't able to check your hands when we went to showdown. The thing was not working. So if anybody's wondering why I'm not checking his hands, that's why. I gave up on it probably by now. So yeah, if we're going to be betting most of our flush draws on the flop as pre-flop raiser in position, but we're going to check some of our flush draws back, to me it makes the most sense to check back hands that have some showdown value, because if you have ace high or you have a pair to go with your flush draw, then if you could just end the hand right there, it wouldn't be too bad, right? Because your one pair will win some of the time. And by that same kind of logic, it helps to get one step closer to showdown when you've got showdown value. Now, if you've got like top pair plus nut flush draw or top pair plus flush draw, then I think you just need to be value betting heads up. I don't think this applies necessarily in the same way to a full ring game, but heads up, I think top pair with a flush draw is strong enough that you'd love to just get stacks in on the flop. But it's kind of the same concept. In a, like say a full ring game, live, 2-5, I was just having this conversation with a buddy of mine, maybe if you have like ace-2 suited and you flop top pair with nut flush draw, people get confused there, and I think they like to check raise and get it in, but you know, that's usually not the best way to play that hand when you're playing a full ring game. And for the same reasons that it makes a lot of sense to have that kind of hand in your check calling range in a full ring game, I think having pair plus flush draw or an ace plus nut flush draw makes a lot of sense heads up, to check back, if you're going to have to check back some of your draws for showdown value. This was a shitty spot you put me in here. My rationale was that you have enough busted draws and combo draws to make that a call, but it was really, really close. I didn't really think that you'd have that many value hands that would not have raised the flop or turn because of how textured the board was, how many like pair plus draws, flush draws, straight draws I'm going to have in my range. I would have thought you would have raised the flop most of the time with hands that beat my ace, and I would have thought that you would have 3-bet pre-flop with or 4-bet pre-flop with most of the aces that it had me out-kicked, with the exception of maybe ace-10 and ace-jack, but those would have made 2-pair on the flop that I really would have expected. If you had 2-pair, you would have raised me on the flop and tried to get it in. And I thought most of the time if you had a jack on the turn, you also would have raised and tried to get it in. You didn't, and you had more jacks in your range than I would have expected you to have, because I would not have expected you to call with such a small jack. But when you checked back the, when you didn't raise pre-flop, you didn't raise on the flop, you didn't raise on the turn. To me, it seemed pretty unlikely that you had a monster value hand on the river. I really was expecting to check, and for you to usually check back. I just didn't think there were very many hands that I could get value from by betting again. So I expected to check and watch you go check back, and then I was going to win the pot. That was the game plan. Once you bet, I had to kind of reconsider and think, well, what's he betting? And it seemed to me like you probably had more busted draws than hands that wanted to bet again for value. So if you're calling flop, calling turn, betting river on that run out, I thought you would have at least, I actually thought you'd probably have more busted draws and combo draws that were like pair plus draw that decided to turn themselves into bluffs. Then you would have legitimate value hands that actually wanted to get stacks in or wanted to get another bet in on the river. So I was wrong. A lot of my assumptions, I think my assumptions were correct about players in general, and I actually think my assumptions were even correct about you in general. I think that was just one of those spots where you took a loss leader play and you made kind of the non-optimal play, probably for deception. I would warn against that. I don't think you want to be doing that. So yeah, hopefully that's worth something. I'm sorry I didn't get. I don't have the audio from any of this that I originally recorded. So yeah, hopefully that's better than nothing, guy. Welcome, and I hope you enjoy my YouTube channel, Coaching Opportunities. Any correspondence, again, it's dondoust@gmail.com. The entire group of people, I know there's not a ton of them, but we're building. I get a lot of emails and do a lot of coaching sessions. I do cheap and sometimes even free coaching, so hit me up if you want to talk about that. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section. And until next time, Austin, good luck to you and everybody else. Good quote, LUCK exclamation point end quote. Navonod, over and out.